Welcome back to Landmarks Discovered. In this episode, we're filming on site at Sea Gull Cottage, the oldest residence in the town of Palm Beach. Today we're talking about Sea Gull Cottage, which was the first residence that Henry Flagler lived in when he came to Palm Beach. Additionally, it's also the first town-serving project that the Preservation Foundation did in its early years as an organization.
When we talk about Sea Gull Cottage, we really talk about it in comparison to what was already here in the town of Palm Beach. It was built in 1886, but it was the first structure that had special materials brought down by barge, when in comparison the pioneers were building with local materials. So when R.R. McCormick purchased the lot and built it in 1886, he brought down some of the finest materials that Palm Beach had seen, such as marble flooring, and there is a rumor that the original mahogany staircase actually came from a shipwreck.
Well, and my understanding is that R.R. McCormick actually holds the title of the first millionaire to build a vacation home here.
Yes, so he was considered to be a railroad magnate, and he came down to Palm Beach and thought it was incredibly beautiful and, purchased a lot here for about $10,000. And he built Sea Gull Cottage at the cost of $30,000. And he also experimented with the land too. So when Flagler came here to see the cottage in the early 1890s, he saw such beautiful vegetation because R.R. McCormick actually planted rose bushes everywhere. As photos were published of Sea Gull Cottage, especially in comparison to the frame vernacular of the pioneer homes, you could see that it was incredibly beautiful for its time.
Well, I think it's telling that so many historic photographs from that time period exist. It illustrates how important this house was in the community, because when we think about a lot of the other homes from that era, we have very few interior images.
And it's rumored that Flagler was drawn to this region because he saw an image of Sea Gull Cottage, and he stated that he didn't know a building that beautiful could exist south of Rockledge.
When Flagler bought Sea Gull Cottage from McCormick for $75,000 in 1893, it really started setting off the land boom here in Palm Beach, and many pioneers started selling their homesteads as well.
And became millionaires overnight. Let's talk about the various names that this building has had over time. In an early historic photograph of the home, when it was presumably owned by R.R. McCormick, it was called Lac à Mer because it was a lake-to-ocean track. However, when Flagler bought it, he named it something different.
Right, it was called Croton House after all of the croton plants surrounding the house.
And then in 1913, when the home was relocated to the Breakers property on the ocean, it was given a new moniker of Sea Gull Cottage.
By the time the foundation was formed in the 1980s, many of the grand estates that we recognize as some of Palm Beach's most fantastic architecture were already demolished. So we had already lost El Marisol, Playa Oriente, and Casa Bendita. And so when Sea Gull Cottage was threatened with demolition because it was part of the original Breakers cottages in the 1980s, it was decided that the first project of the Preservation Foundation would be to restore and save Sea Gull Cottage.
And, when you think about the condition of what this building was in, it was really incredible that such a newly founded organization was willing to take on a project of this scale.
Marie, when did the foundation really become active in saving Sea Gull Cottage?
Well, Earl E.T. Smith was really the main person who felt very strongly that Sea Gull Cottage needed to be saved. He knew that it couldn't just be a memory. And so he spearheaded the efforts to raise the campaign for saving Sea Gull Cottage. And what's interesting is they moved the house very close back to its original location. And so Sea Gull Cottage originally was located where Sotheby's is by the Royal Poinciana Plaza.
And that's known as the Hibble Building, which is a Marion Sims Wyeth building.
So the Sea Gull Cottage had to be moved in two parts. So the building was divided, and each part weighed about 100 tons. The company that moved Sea Gull Cottage also moved the Royal Poinciana Chapel back in 1971. It was called La Plante Adair. And they were considering also, before using this company, moving the cottage by helicopter or by barge, but they decided on using a moving truck. And so we have this great footage of the cottage being moved in two separate pieces. They had to choreograph the building's movement through the streets of Palm Beach. And they couldn't drive for more than 5 miles per hour while doing so.
And I'm actually very entertained by the thought of these two building sections being driven across the Breakers golf course.
And there's some great oral histories from some of our members who were there saying they actually had to leave the house there overnight. So in the morning, when some golfers were there, they were like, what is the house doing on the golf course?
The foundation raised $600,000, and a large portion of those funds also came from the Colonial Dames of America, who were also closely involved in the process of selecting the furniture and the new decorative elements in the building. Old photographs were essential to the process. And so a lot of these photographs really gave a lot of inspiration and direct input to all of the different parties who were involved in recreating Sea Gull Cottage. Barbara Hofstadt, who led the restoration campaign, was very passionate about the details of Sea Gull Cottage. So there was rumors that they wanted to paint this building white when it was moved. However, Hofstadt firmly believed that it should be painted either Flagler yellow or returned to its original color, which was called McCormick blue-gray. And it ended up being McCormick blue-gray, but we have some great letters in the archive that show a lot of her advocacy and the passion that made those decisions happen. Another important person involved in this process was director of the foundation at the time, Polly Earle. She was very committed to creating the space exactly as it was during the Victorian times. But in doing so, she had to really consider how eclectic Victorian design was at the time. And so she said they really loved to combine different colors and patterns in a way that's very unique. In the new version of the building, there were 5 different types of wall coverings. And a lot of the furniture and design elements were inspired by Charles Eastlake, who was very popular during the Victorian era. He was more influential as a writer and critic, but his designs were known to be more geometric and modern for the time. And he also felt very strongly that all furnishing should be designed by skilled craftsmen and not by machines. So the foundation worked very closely overseeing the entire process, and they, much to Eastlake's ideals, they worked with a lot of craftsmen and artisans. So one being Bradbury and Bradbury, who did all of the wall coverings. And they were so passionate about re-envisioning the space and how there would be all these different gilded wall coverings. So it's really exciting to see all that color and eclectic design be pulled together in the new version in 1985. The foundation also worked with Mick Mao, who did the stained glass, and they visited Kokomo in Indiana, where a lot of Tiffany glass was made, just to see what the kind of texture the stained glass would be. And that's one of the most unique features of this space. As you enter Sea Gull Cottage, you see some of the original parts of the structure, which are the marble floors, which were brought down by barge from Georgia in the entryway. And in the 1985 rehabilitation, they relocated the fireplace from upstairs to the parlor. And the second bedroom became the Fortin Library, which was part of the foundation. The main staircase features the reproduction of the original staircase spandrel, which is believed to have come from the Pittsburgh Landmarks Foundation. And the new antique Neo-Egyptian chandelier was on loan from the Flagler Museum. So there was so much interest in design around the world. And that connection I was making, it's a light connection, but the connection I was making with the 1980s and the 1880s was the 1980s was when postmodernism was becoming more popular. And again, taking elements and aspects from different design principles and then reinterpreting them. So very, very different, of course, but I can't help but make that connection between those two eras. And the puff sleeves, too. So in a way, Sea Gull Cottage exists in two periods of time, in the late 1800s and then in the 1980s. And during this 100 years, it had to, the restoration had to show the historical accuracy, but it also had to make the building function for modern day use.
Well, and I think one of the great victories of this project, and there are many, is the agreement that the Preservation Foundation was able to work out with the Royal Poinciana Chapel to move it to the site where it sits today. And initially, my understanding was the building was only landmarked for a period of 20 years.
Correct. And then it was landmarked permanently in 2010.
And Sea Gull Cottage is such a great example of the different types of preservation you can do with a building. The first time it was restored, it was really a true restoration to, the 1890s when Flagler and R.R. McCormick owned the building. And in the early 2000s, it was really a rehabilitation project, which changed the use of the building from a historic home to a working space for the Royal Poinciana Chapel where they could hold youth groups and meetings.
And one of the things that I think is really interesting, tying it back to our history as an organization, is that this was actually our headquarters at one time.
That's right. It was our headquarters from 1985 to 1989.
Ultimately, Sea Gull Cottage really set the tone for the Preservation Foundation's town-serving projects, then and now, and really challenged us to always dream big and to know that really no goal was insurmountable, because ultimately we have the knowledge on staff, we have the archives available and history, and most importantly, we have a community that has a desire to support these kinds of projects, and that really is key to all of our successes. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Landmarks Discovered. On our next episode, we'll visit the Bath and Tennis Club.